It's been 18 years since Code Geass graced the world, and 5 years since Fukkatsu no Lelouch kicked off the franchise's 10-year plan. Code Geass Dakkan no Roze was the culmination of the plan's first half, a rushed, edgy, and hollow legacy sequel that poorly remixed and reused elements of the original series more than it actually put forth anything new and compelling. Perhaps the two greatest examples of this are how both shows open and both shows end. I might do a video sometime in the future comparing the first 3 episodes of OG Geass to the Rozé premiere that apes them, but for now let's talk about the much maligned ending. The ending of Code Geass R2 shocked the world in 2008. Capping off the absolute roller coaster ride of a reception, the ending of the series cemented R2 and Code Geass at large as one of the defining anime of the 2000s. Its finale would remain among anime's most acclaimed for over 15 years. There's a reason why there was so much skepticism and division over the idea of trying to continue past it, even with the alternate timeline being cooked up with the recap film trilogy. Speak to any AniTuber who started their YouTube career during that time, or who otherwise followed the episode discussions when R2 dropped, and they'll tell you more than I ever could. By contrast, the ending of Dakkan no Roze might be even more maligned than Akito's absolute thud of a conclusion. It's not just because of how bad an ending this was for its characters and the absolute dumpster fire of a narrative, it's also because of how it exemplifies how empty this show is and how little mileage it got out of the few ideas and characters it even had. In every way R2's finale works, Rozé's doesn't. At least, every way that matters. For all its faults, R2's back half thrust a new set of themes upon us. Season 1 focused a lot on discrimination, the difficulties of trying to operate within a system designed to oppress your kind, and how sometimes, not everyone is equipped to engage in a proper ideological argument, especially when in opposing sides of a rebellion. R2 threw new ideas like the dangers of secrecy, and most important to the finale, a clash between people representing the past, present, and future, and that reflects their views on attaining world peace. Emperor Charles V. Britannia was a man stuck in the past, wanting to merge the living and the dead into an amorphous collective consciousness to end all the conflict that marked his youth. Schneisel L. Britannia was focused on freezing the present by pointing a gun at the world and going, "Cooperate with each other or die!" He was an adequate final antagonist for Lelouch, mild-mannered and weary of the meaningless bloodshed, but more than willing to harm or kill anyone who tries to stop him from ending it his way. Lelouch v. Britannia looked towards the future, where everyone was free to make their own path forward in a united world order that would oversee itself to maintain peace through diplomacy first and foremost. After Charles was out of the picture, it became Lelouch and Schneisel fighting for the fate of the world with all its forces. Two egotistical scheming fucks duking it out for control, discarding anyone in their way and hurting the people closest to them for their greater goals. There was another long-standing conflict that came to a head here, that being Suzaku versus Colin. As I brought up in a previous video, these two represented working within a system that hates your kind while becoming everything wrong with it, and fighting from the outside and embracing one's people and identity that the system hates, respectively. With the Black Knights switching from Lelouch's leadership to Schneisel's, and Suzaku putting aside his long-standing grudge with Lelouch to take down even greater evils and aid his ambitions, suddenly these positions have been flipped, and now both parties embody both, arguing the same positions with the opposite contexts. This finale is not only conceptual, but also layered, like an ogre. The last 4 episodes greatly deliver on everything the show had built up. Rozé instead has murder Roombas committing omnicide because Code Geass's take on Gundam Unicorn's full frontal was like, humanity? Ew. Norland von Lunebelg doesn't represent an idea. Hell, Sakia Simuragi launches like 10 different possible motivations he could have, and they all get rejected before she lands on disgust, and he wordlessly smiles while entering his mech. It's just, we gotta get our heroes to stop the bad guy from destroying humanity. You could say that since we see several characters work within the Neo-Britannian system to do right by the Japanese in their own way, having them work with our heroes is the culmination of that, but that idea is underdeveloped, and the only people who even confront Norland are Ash, Sakia, and Catherine. The first two are the mercenary protagonists of the show, and Catherine Sabatra wasn't even working from the inside. She was a military participant in Neo-Britannia's totalitarian regime over Hokkaido, and she only fought him because Sakura, the body double and puppet empress, gave her a speech about lonely strength versus true strength that got to her. And because she survived an attack by a murder Roomba. Everyone else just fights off murder Roombas who suck up people and spew them out as blood geysers turning into blood mist. Rozé does little to interact with, let alone advance, any of the ideas previous installments worked with, and the ending isn't conceptually or ideologically driven in the least. Rozé is spectacle and emotion driven, just like the original series, but with none of the style, and with little actual conceptual progress. It's just the good guys fighting off murder Roomba armies, and Ash and Rozé fighting against an underwhelming 3-phase boss, where the first 2 phases are unwinnable, and the final phase is dodging a bunch of stun lasers from a largely disinterested plank of wood before killing him. The fight doesn't feel nearly as personal or involved as the final duel between Suzaku and Colin, nor does it have the satisfying moments of Lelouch thwarting Snigel's plan, which is unfortunate because both of our main protagonists have a grudge against him specifically, and the middle of the show actually provides some backstory as to why. We get some cool tracking shots, and that's about it. Perhaps the other main difference between the two in terms of quality is in how well these endings serve as conclusions for their characters. As I went over in my video on Lelouch and Suzaku, their fates were pitch perfect. Lelouch pulled one final gambit to unite the world against him so they could rejoice the moment he died, and work together towards world peace as they remain unified. For all his good intentions, he's painfully aware of his hypocrisies and the increasingly inhumane carnage and suffering he's caused, intentionally and otherwise. He could not belong in the world he wished to create for his sister and everyone else. Meanwhile, Suzaku tried and largely failed to work within a discriminatory system that oppressed his people and constantly hamstrung him until Euphemia shared her heart and clout with him to make a feasible first step in their goals. After that died with her, which was after Suzaku was confronted with the memories he made his current moral compass to repress, he gave up much of the pretense when it came to his ideological rival and political enemy, Lelouch. He tried to repress the memory of killing his father, but embraced trying to kill Lelouch after everything, including being ordered to live via the Geass. That, and via the Geass, he activated the Fleya during the Battle of Tokyo, decimating millions, and finally accepting what his detractors had been telling him all along. He finally recognized his faults, and worked together with Lelouch to do something about it and everything they had been fighting against. Where Lelouch allowed himself to be sentenced to die for the world, Suzaku allowed himself to be sentenced to live under his enemy's iconic alter ego to serve the people he lied to and hurt for the world as continual penance. Their punishments felt appropriate and fitting to their trajectories as characters, while they also felt at least somewhat appropriate for most of the Black Knights and the remaining Britannian officials, seeing as how they all got some good prison time and extreme public humiliation before being freed and made to work under Lelouch's government. Well, except for Cornelia. She was never imprisoned and never seemed remorseful of her crimes against the Japanese. But in the movie timeline, she at least went to work with Lelouch's government later anyway. Then we have Rozé, which does the exact opposite. Let's work our way backwards and ignore the 7 shining stars, as their endings are fine enough. But these Black Knight XPs barely had characters to begin with. That, and they never teamed up with the bad guys, so whatever. While some of the remaining Neo-Britannians did work with Sakura and or Sakia from the inside, that still leaves Nada and Catherine. Nada, at best, wanted to protect Britannian children like those at the orphanage she grew up in, but she still participated in military excursions against the rebellion. Admittedly, she didn't do any war crimes or any of the extreme fronts of violent discrimination that some of her peers did, but she was complicit up until Norland threw murder Roombas at everyone. Catherine, meanwhile, was an active military participant, even if she also didn't casually murder Japanese people on the streets. However, she did still view and treat them with disdain, unlike Nada. And again, she only turned on him due to murder Roombas and Sakura's speech making her want to test if Norland really was as strong as she idolized. Neither of them got prison time at all. Both girls happily got to work at an orphanage after the final battle. They basically got off scot-free. It at least makes sense that Natalia and Walther would be let off the hook, and maybe Nada as well, considering she was part of the peace conference that got attacked. But Catherine's a real outlier in this one, you know? Conversely, the main heroes get needlessly punitive and dour endings. Ash was groomed to be an assassin, along with his younger brother, after Norland adopted them from an orphanage. The same orphanage Nara grew up in, actually. After Norland murdered said brother, and Ash failed to kill him in retaliation, our guys spent some time in prison, conversing with the overthrown governor of Hokkaido, Jugo Sumeragi. After they tried to escape prison and free Jugo and Sakuya, Jugo ends up dying, turning an already despairful man into one of guilt. Beyond his love of and care for pets, he continues to seek revenge, even while being needlessly put under a Geass by Sakuya, who didn't know all of that context until later. Even after his Geass was undone, and he learns that Sakuya only posed as his brother to further spite him, seeing as he stated he murdered her father, he eventually forgives her. Hell, he fell in love with a different alter ego of hers that she was roped into, and towards the end, they have a sort of lady and knight relationship. The idea of killing him off here is meant to hurt the audience, and bring a few things full circle. Like him parroting Sakuya's father's thoughts that death doesn't scare him, but never seeing Sakuya again guts him. Unfortunately, the way we get here is entirely unnecessary and convoluted for the sake of emotionally manipulating the audience. After the main duo defeats Norland in a sky battle, Ash's mech doesn't have enough energy to keep going, even though Sakuya's is the one that is actually flying, and Ash only detached to land a killing blow. He does try to frame it as, it's Norland, even his death could be up to something out of spite. But like, just have Sakuya catch him and shoot the part of the mech that Ash punctured. There is no good narrative reason given to actually kill him off. And it's far too extreme an ending for a man who at this point saved more lives than he was forced to end. As such, Sakuya's grief over his death rings hollow. None of this was earned, and it doesn't make sense in the context it happened under. Sakuya's ending isn't exactly better. The idea for her is that she slowly starts to regret Geassing and manipulating Ash the more she learns about him, making her slowly understand what Lelouch meant when he gave her the forewarning that the power of kings is isolating. Between that and how she's later forced by Christoph Scissorman to choose between Geassing a bunch of Japanese prisoners or watching them die, she starts becoming racked with guilt. Seeing as her parallels with Lelouch are direct, unlike Ash's parallels with Suzaku, which pretty much start and end with being the deuteragonist, it makes sense that they'd put her on a similar path, but switch the final status of the protagonist deuterag for this one. Unfortunately, her ending is also too punishing to be satisfying or appropriate. After the final battle, she weeps for Ash and gets to take her body double's place as the true new Empress of Britannia. She then decides that her power, which is basically the same as Lelouch's, except it's more auditory than reliant on eye contact, is so dangerous that she should never be allowed to speak again. She Geasses herself into becoming mute, and later on learns sign language to be able to communicate again, outside of just being a figurehead who smiles and bows. I get what they were going for, but the decision comes off as impulsive to an uncharacteristic degree, even considering that she Geassed someone she reasonably assumed was still an enemy after a prison break. That and Geassing some guy into giving her his bike during a chase are basically the only bad things she did. And even then, she didn't have the context to know that Ash was actually going to protect her, so really, outside of that other thing, which was fairly minor, the only bad thing she did in all of this was pose as Ash's brother. That one didn't require context to be a dick move, especially since that happened before Ash told her that he killed Jugo. A large chunk of what made Lelouch's and Suzaku's ending so perfect is how they both committed and or caused genuine atrocities, even if those were usually done by accident. They had the blood of thousands, if not millions, on their hands, even outside of the few people they personally killed. They deceived and betrayed everyone around them, and came to a conclusion on what their destiny has to be for the sake of the world. Sure, you could say that another part of why this all worked is because we spent 50 episodes following them instead of 12. But I can name a fair amount of one-core or shorter mecha that had much more satisfactory endings for its cast than Rozé ever did. The worst thing Ash did was assassinate people like he was groomed into doing. And the worst thing Sakuya ever did was brainwash Ash into believing her Rozé persona was his little brother. That and I guess kill a Neo-Britannian knight who hated her and felt no remorse for slaughtering the Japanese. But as a parallel to when Lelouch killed Clovis, even though Clovis was actually happy to see him alive, it's not quite the same, you know? Their endings don't feel poetic or fitting. They feel more undeserved than Catherine's. As for more general issues, the last quarter of the series feels rushed in general, and those stupid fucking murder Roombas push the show into being even more needlessly edgy and difficult to take seriously than ever. The only other conflict in the finale is the battling between our other heroes and said murder Roombas. So on top of most of them barely having a defined character, there's nothing to connect them to any of the show's meager themes. Even some of the characters who are presumed to have survived, such as Yoko and Walther, aren't able to actually appear in the epilogue scene. The finale feels less like a combination of the show with sending off, and more like a hacked-together final boss and rush job for a series running on fumes. There's hardly any tension in the final act, much like a large chunk of the show for that matter, due to the ridiculously edgy nature of the murder Roombas and how little reason we're given to be invested in half the remaining cast by this point. I think I'll leave you with one final contrast. The ending of Code Geass with R2's finale back in 2008 cemented the original series as a beloved mainstream title that still sees some recognition 16 years later. The ending of Dakkan no Roze is the final nail in the coffin for a greatest hits legacy sequel whose reception wasn't all that positive to begin with.